This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 59.
I don't teach English. I teach kids. I teach students. I teach human beings, right? Like the subject is, and not secondary, but I mean, it's not everything.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt. Is your mic on, Rogers? Matt and I just had an amazing discovery. So I've had the same mic for almost every episode. So about 58 recordings. I think I switched after our first one. Matt got the same exact microphone as me, and he asked during our recording with our guest if he sounded better. And I just said yes because I wanted to be nice. I didn't really notice any much of a difference. Come to find after the recording, he was still using his default MacBook microphone. So as we were playing around between recordings, Matt, say hi to everybody so they can hear how nice you sound.
Good morning, everyone. Or good evening, good day, whatever. Hi, guys.
So he turns it on, and I said, wow, it does make a difference. And then he asked, are you supposed to talk in the top or the side? And as we rotated it around, we realized that the side is the winner. And so now I'm talking to the side as well as you. So this might be the smoothest voice our listeners have ever heard in 59 shows.
It took long enough for us to actually use the equipment appropriately. But Ken, it is nice to talk to you loud and clear. Now comfort from our own homes. Last week, buddy, it was great to see you in person. So we haven't done that in, 59 episodes. So with that being said, life is really good. We're recording this in February. We had a little bit of a snow, not impeding school at all. We're gearing up for whatever spring break looks like. I don't know what it looks like for you, but we have professional development a ton, and things are starting to tighten up for the most wonderful time of the year, testing season.
Absolutely, yeah. This whole microphone debacle we had, it brings me back to those times where you're in the classroom and someone figures something out really cool, or you do, and it just gets the class just like jacked up and excited, whether it's academically related or not. And our guest tonight, Stephanie Noll from New Mexico, talks about stuff that is way more exciting and way more relevant than microphones. But she kind of has that same attitude of like, she just wants her kids to love her class and not love her as a teacher, but love the content that they're talking about. We're talking about high school English. So she does a great job of painting the picture of how she creates that culture in her classroom. What were some of your takeaways?
So you'll hear kind of a unique background, and something I wonder if other educators in her position wish they were brave and bold enough to make the choice. So she teaches at the collegiate level and then realizes that she wants to go back into the classroom. And Ken, I know you and I have talked about, and you'll talk a little bit later about this idea of coming back into the classroom, even as a coach, this idea of remembering what it's like to be in front of kids, because the longer you go that you're not directly with kids for 7 hours a day, things start to shift from, hey, what it's like, to I remember what it was like, or I have some stories of what it was like, to I'm sure it's like. And especially in an advisement role or an assessment role or supervision role, supervisory role. Um, really understanding where the teacher they're coming from is really important. So to watch Stephanie make that shift is kudos to her. And I think she feels, and you'll hear about this, being just so prepared to go into the classroom and take all that she's learned to make this experience in the classroom so much more beneficial than her first. And I'm sure she did an incredible job the first go around too.
Yeah, 100%. I really enjoyed that, and I did not know that about her until we talked to her tonight. I knew she was a teacher, high school teacher in New Mexico, so that was really exciting to dive into that, because like I said in the interview, I don't know anybody that has taken that career trajectory. So let's not delay this any further. Let's jump into that interview with Matt's default mic, Ken talking from the top, and our amazing guest Stephanie Noll. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing real well. How are you guys?
We're doing fantastic. We're really excited to jump into this conversation. We were just introducing ourselves before the show, and come to find that we have a lot of local childhood connections, which is super funny. Thinking Matt and I are from Pennsylvania, and Stephanie will share where she is right now. So to officially kick things off for us, why don't you just introduce yourself, where you are coming from, and just kind of a snapshot of what your career in education has looked like.
I'm talking to you from northern New Mexico, a small town called Chemisal. It's about 20 miles south of Taos. Very very rural. Our little village is one of 300. The district where I teach, which is about 5 miles down the road, that's a town of fewer than 1,000. Um, yeah, it's a beautiful beautiful part of the world. We moved here from Austin, Texas, which, like, my big joke is always, we left like the number one city for everything, like, to come to this like really tiny place. But with lots of good reasons and no regrets. I was in Austin. I was working at Texas State University as a senior lecturer, mentoring and training student teachers, teaching freshman composition. I taught a course in the honors college, and supervised student teachers and taught a pedagogy class as well. And I I was there for about 12 years, and I received my master's actually in creative writing, a master's of fine arts from Texas State, prior to getting hired on as a senior lecturer. Um, but I always wanted to go back to the high school classroom because that's where I started. I'm a product of public schools. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, and knew pretty much from a young age, like, fought it for a while, that like teaching was something that I was really interested in. I always say, like, when I was in high school English classes, and I had great teachers, and but I was also I was that student. It was just sort of reading and writing was my thing, but it's not for everybody. And so I would get so frustrated, for my classmates because they were not engaged the way that I was. And I kept thinking, like, but they could be. Like, I love this so much, and I think it's so important and so fun and interesting. And they are totally tuned out to it. And it was like I could understand why they were, right? Just they weren't being engaged. What we were reading and doing felt really dated, I'm sure. And so yeah, it felt like going into teaching felt like the right thing to do. I was very much encouraged by my father, who said, if you go into teaching, I wanted to be an English major at first, and he was like, "Yeah, what are you going to do with an English degree?" And I didn't know, and so he said, "I think you should look into teaching. You'll never be without a job," and which has proven to be true, very much
Especially
so.
now.
And yeah, especially now, you have your pick, and yeah, I guess I just felt like. I wanted to give it a try, and just kind of see. And I immediately fell in love with my education classes. Just was really drawn to the field immediately. And I want to say it was like my first or second semester of my freshman year. I was in an educational theory and policy class, and we watched this documentary about inner city schools and the challenges that they faced. And I was just like horrified. I mean, my school was um, suburban, mostly middle class, upper middle class. And it wasn't that like I wasn't aware that it was different in some places, but this documentary just was revelatory. And I went right to my advisor afterwards, and I was like, just emoting. I was like, I just can't believe what I saw. Do you know that this is happening? Like, there's schools where they don't have books, and like the facilities are a mess, and like the classrooms are crowded. And he handed me an application for Teach for America and said, I think this is what you're going to do. And so I did. I mean, that was my freshman year. And so then, I just kept falling more and more, like just sort of into my passion for teaching. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to apply. I'm going to do this program because I thought that this is where I want to be. Like, I think I really want to go to the places where there's great need.
We
And I
had
got
another
accepted.
guest who worked for Teach for America. I'll have to look back in the show. 13 is standing out to me just because it's my favorite number. I think that's what she was on. But
Yeah, right.
she talked about, she's probably 15 years into her career and the level of impact that that program had on her because of the depth that they go into to coaching you to be a teacher is far more than what you're typically getting in undergrad programs. Because I don't know if this is the case in the group you were with, but a lot of the people in that program actually are not going to end up being teachers, but they're doing
Yes.
it to gain experience and to for various reasons, but they end up going a different path. So I guess Teach for America feels the responsibility of training them even more heavily. So, and she spoke very highly of that program.
Yeah, my experience was really strong, and I appreciated, I was one of the only ones, I think, and probably the only one in my cohort in Houston. That's where I ended up, um, who had studied education, had student taught. I mean, while I went there with considerable more experience than my peers, at the same time, it was not. So I did my student teaching in State College, Pennsylvania. So I'm working with very upper middle class students. Parents are professors and doctors. I mean, I had sort of like cream of the crop at State College High, very resourced, just all kinds of advantages that my students had and experiences that they had that my students in Houston, that wasn't going to happen. Those things weren't happening for them. So there was a little bit of like a what what how could you train for this, like, um how could a educational preparatory program like train me for where I taught in Houston. And so I do think Teach for America offers really strong support for you once you're in the classroom. I mean, and that's why I wanted to go, because I felt like I really want to go into, um, a high needs school, but I don't want to feel like I'm going there without some kind of like community, or like, just kind of an instant, like we're all doing this. And that's how Teach for America operates. Like they have these cohorts and you have these meetings and, all kinds of professional development while you're there as a core member. And so I made some of my very dearest friends for life while I was in Houston. And I mean, I always say like it changed my life. I mean, and I think in that I just, and here I am 25 years later, almost 25 years later, still in education and going back to the high school classroom after a pretty long leave. I mean, I was out of the high school classroom for over a decade. No, I mean 2 decades, gosh. So yeah, it's been a while, and I just always felt like that's where I needed to get back to. And my experience at Teach for America was 1,000% why. Um I wanted to feel like I was a part of a community. I wanted to feel like I could, the impact that I was making on my students could be tangible, I guess. Like and teaching at the university was wonderful and taught me a lot about teaching, and helped me, I think, to refine like some of my practice. But the connections and the community are just not the same at all. And the impact is not the same at all. I mean, you have students for a semester that you see once or twice a week, right? Like, not, here where I'm teaching right now, like, I will know all of my students. I will know them intimately, in the classroom, having taught them for 4 full years, and that's not an experience that you get at the university at all, right? So, I wanted to get back to that work really badly. Yeah,
I
that's a
think
long. That was a long answer to like.
yeah, well, I think I'd love to kind of tear it apart because there's a few
Yeah,
things that I know. I'm fascinated to hear. You know, I have a student teacher this year, and it's the first time that I have a student teacher. And today in our conversation, we talked about like what is that 5-10 year goal, right? And just like to set the framework because I think when you're coming out of academia, whether you're the student or working in that field, it is very theoretical. The further you get away from, we'll say, traditional K through 12 age students, the easier your problems become to solve. Because you know what? You throw this behavior management idea out, of course it works. Why? Because the kids are theoretical, or you have this problem in the class and it is theoretical, so you can kind of navigate it with, oh, you do this and this and this and this. So I would love to kind of tear that apart, but before we really go into it, that first 2-3 years in education is such a throwaway time, if you will, for a lot of us educators. What I mean by that is we wish we could throw it away. We know it's a part of our history. We can't necessarily avoid it. And a program like Teach for America is such a powerful thing because you create this, as you were saying, a cohort of people that go through a really tough environment, B, a really tough responsibility, and C, a really tough time in your life all together. And so having that, I actually think is a great support system. Not that the districts needed you less or were more okay with you being less successful, but there was an element that, coming in to a classroom through a program with the support, that it wasn't so much professional based had to have been a benefit, because if you go into education, you graduate, you get a job, your responsibility is to be good enough that they hand you a contract and they hand you tenure. It's a little bit different, and if you can break your chops in through a program like that, it almost gives you grace while also giving you a great support system.
I think that's a really important point to make, because I think, I really like what you said about it's a really difficult time in life. And when I look back on, I was 21 years old when I started in the classroom, in Houston. I had students who were 20. And one of my mentor, who was not from Teach for America, he was a mentor at my school, who became such a dear friend, said, "Don't. They're going to ask you how old you are. Don't tell them, but don't add some years on, right? Tell them, but don't tell them your real age." So I told I told them I was 25, I think. Anyway, and so I was at that school for 4 years, and as I was watching, my freshmen become seniors, and they came to me one day and they were like, "Miss, we've been talking and we're just kind of worried because we think that you should start thinking about getting married. Like, you're getting older." And I was like, "What? Like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't even." And they're like, "Well, Miss, you're almost 30." And I was like, "Oh my God, it worked." I was like, "No, I'm 25." It's like, I lied to you. Um, it's like, and then it was like, when I think back on that, I'm like, I was 21 years old and I walked into a classroom, with that first year I taught ninth grade and 12th grade. And I just remember looking at my students and thinking, like, I should not be here. Like what? Like I am barely making it at life. Like, I don't even know what that means. I don't know what I'm doing at all at life. And here I am with you. Like, what is happening? It just felt really challenging. And so I think the Teach for America piece, when I think back on that, is that we were all, 21, 22, all sort of like, you're transplanted, right? So some of my dearest friends, I mean, I went from Pennsylvania to Houston. Some of my other friends were they were from St. Louis and what, the small Appleton, Wisconsin, and Virginia. Like, it just, so we were all like, nobody was of the place. We were all about the same age, and we were all sort of just making it up as we went and trying to figure things out together. And that was so incredibly just I don't know, it just felt good on the really difficult days. One of my dearest friends who did leave the classroom in her first year, which was absolutely the right decision, like, and good, what she needed to do, and I totally supported her. But we used to carpool to school, and we would listen to this Belle and Sebastian song that the chorus is like, "Get me away from here, I'm dying." And we would like listen to it on the way to school and listen to it home. It just, it was hard. It was so intense. And to have somebody else like sharing that intensity and being like your mirror and saying like, yeah, this is difficult, was incredibly helpful. Just incredibly helpful. Yeah.
I think, regardless of the age you're teaching, every teacher feels the way you did when you were describing about being 21, because, as an elementary teacher, the kids are nowhere near your age. But,
Right.
my
Right.
first year, I subbed for a full year with a second grade stint in there for a couple months. So, fast forward to my first full year teaching fifth grade, I was 23, I guess would be the right age. And, fall conferences, I'm sitting here talking about, you know, not giving parental advice, but in some capacities, giving parental advice when we're talking about strategies to help their students grow both in school and at home. And, you just kind of step into that role and, thinking like, I got engaged at the end of my first year and I didn't have kids for, multiple years after that. And, being 23, like, how mature am I really? But, I think that's a responsibility that teachers wear, and why it's so important for teachers to focus on character and focus on the way we carry ourselves and being role models. And, I'll never forget a principal mentor of mine that was a principal of mine as a child, and I stayed in touch and kind of helped me and mentored me through the college years and getting into a couple of my first positions. He told me, he said, listen, when I hire for character. He said, I can teach someone how to be a good teacher. I can't teach someone how to be a good role model. I can't teach someone how to be passionate about learning and growing and taking risks. He's like, that's what I look for when I hire someone. And Teach for
Yeah.
America is kind of the same thing. Like, they can teach you how to do it, but you have to be mature. You have to be a good person. You have to have those things. You have to have those things lined up. What I want to
I
ask you
always say
about,
like,
go ahead, please.
yeah. No, I was just going to say, when I was mentoring student teachers and when I taught the language, like the pedagogy, the ELA pedagogy class at the university. And then I mentored, anywhere from like 6 to 10 student teachers a semester. And one of the things that I said then, and I felt very strongly when I was a beginning teacher and still feel strongly to this day, like, if you don't enjoy being around kids, like the age group that you're about to teach, then, and it's no judgment, not at
Mm,
all. Like, but you probably want to reconsider this because so much of, I mean, that's it, that's the job, is spending time with young people. And if you don't find joy in that, then you probably want to walk away. Yeah, so I think about that a lot, that and that I don't teach English, I teach kids, I teach students, I teach human beings, right? Like, the subject is, and and not secondary, but I mean, it's not everything, or like the framing of the subject, I think, needs to be very relevant to the people who are in front of you, who they are, what they want, what their interests are, where their challenges are. Like, that's the work. teaching grammar, spelling, punctuation, whatever like that. I mean, that's a part of it. But showing up every day for your kids, being a role model, enjoying their presence, wanting good things for them, like being, that's what I feel like my particularly right now, because I'm teaching in this really this rural space. It's a very close-knit community. I just like, I'm very invested in what happens to my students, and um I want good things for them in life. And so I feel like my job is to help guide and navigate them towards what that is. I have a sign on my classroom door that says, like, our classroom motto is, this is where we work towards the best version of ourselves every day. And I emphasize the, like, we're working towards it. None of us are there. And how close we are to that version is going to vary from day to day. For me, it varies from period to period depending on what's happening, right? And I just feel like that's such a powerful way to think about what my work is, that I'm providing a space for young people to investigate the world and try to figure out where and who they want to be. That feels like a huge priority and informs my work in a way that, like, is not related to content at all, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're you have those goals of things you want to teach them, life lessons, skills, and your content is the avenue in which you pursue them.
Right.
You'd be teaching
Yeah.
the same you know, goals and strategies and skills. If you were a social studies teacher, your avenue would be different. It would be through the content of history
That's
or
right.
through the content
Yeah.
of math. That's something that's really powerful. It's really hard to do, but that's what makes it an experience where students want to be a part of. But what I wanted to ask you is, I've never met anyone that made it to higher ed to then teach all these pre-service courses and then went back. That's something that I've
Yeah.
I've never heard of, and I think it's amazing because even in my position as a coach, I have said many times that I truly believe if I'm in this position 6, 7 years from now, maybe even less than that, it's time for me to move up to admin, or it's time to me move back to the classroom, because my job as a coach is to be very knowledgeable and relevant of what the classroom experience is like,
Right.
and I can't be away from that too long. As an administrator, it's just kind of part of the role. Like you have to do your best to stay involved, but it's just part of the role. So
Right.
I have to imagine that what you just shared about that connection to students was a huge part of why you went back. But I think you kind of also mentioned like rethinking the way high school instruction can look. What was one or maybe two of the major mindset shifts you had, um, from like a pedagogy standpoint or just an instruction standpoint, that when you came back to the K-12 experience, you had a whole new outlook on the way you should be teaching kids?
I think, my the two words that I feel like really drive what I do, no matter what I'm teaching, no matter what the content is choice and voice, right? And I think that, um, I want to think a little bit about, like, where that shift even came from. But, like, I realized very quickly, when I started teaching in Houston, that the methods and the approaches, and even I should actually even say, like, just even the curriculum, like, this was not gonna, like, hit with my kids. It just was, like, for so many reasons. Like, so many of my students were reading and writing well below grade level, right? So many of my students, when I was teaching in Houston, all of my I was teaching in a school that was um, pretty evenly divided, like 50 to 60% African American, 40% Latino. So, the curriculum that was very white, the dead white males, right? That's all that there was. That was not Like my students were not going to connect with that. And I can talk a little bit too. I mean, I did teach Beowulf, and I did teach Macbeth, and I did teach Julius Caesar, but my approaches, Romeo and Juliet, my approaches were just like wildly different than what I might have been encouraged to do at a different school, right? So,
How so?
and that's the one thing
Could you
that's
dive into
so
that?
yeah, for sure. So, I always say too, like that's the kind of secret I think about that some of us know when you teach in a high needs school is my experience, and I know this isn't across the board, but my experience is like there was it was pretty hands off. They were kind of like, you do you, you know, like go figure it out, which is incredibly terrifying, but also freeing because it was like, okay, so for example, like you know, when I taught Romeo and Juliet, we put Romeo on trial for the murder of, I think it's Tybalt who he kills, right? Um, we when I taught Julius Caesar, we also did a trial. We acted out parts of Macbeth. Oh, Beowulf, they made comic books, right? Like it was just like, here's here's the text, but like you trying to, you know, navigate this language or navigate, like that's not what we're doing here. Like we're not, like I used to joke with my husband that, you know, the teachers would say like, oh yeah, like right now we're doing Romeo and Juliet. I'm like, what does that mean you're doing that? Like you're like, what does it mean to do that, right? And so I think the mindset shift was like, what are the essential questions? Like what are the big questions? Why do these pieces of literature like stick around? And how does that relate to a 15-year-old, you know, African American boy living on the east side of Houston? Like there is a connection, you know. I mean, that's literature offers us those questions and those opportunities to think about our own selves, but somebody's got to provide that frame and lens for you. You're not going to pick up Romeo and Juliet and be like, oh my gosh, I totally get this. Like I totally get this big question of like love versus family. And, you know, I mean, no, like not at all. Um, and so I understood really quickly with my students that I was going, there was not going to be these instances of like, well, read act one and answer the questions, or read act one and we'll talk about it. Like there was going to have to be like a really interactive, creative approach with lots of hooks and lots of like, you know, I don't know, ways to get them excited into the content. And I feel like that has, I mean, that's definitely driven a lot of my, you know, my choices and the way that I teach. Yeah, that was going back to, that was the question, right, about like a
Hmm.
mindset shift that I
Hmm.
had about the work I was doing. Just I kind of got lost in my
Yeah.
No worries.
in my answer.
Well, I think I almost,
Typical
what,
English teacher.
Right? No
yeah.
kidding. No, I just can't stop.
I think when looking at that broad picture, you know, not just, hey, read this, provide this comprehension, traditional comprehension response is the way that you avoid getting frustrated about education. When you are putting students in successful situations where, they, the classic text, like text connections, right? Text to self, text to the world, whatever the case may be, that is the beauty of having the conversation and say, hey, this is a piece of literature that has been read by pretty much any high school student anywhere,
Yes.
but you
Yes.
yourself are going to have a different connection than anyone else in this room. And my goal is to unlock that. And I think, your role in a fairly high need environment doesn't change if your role were to be in a place like where you grew up.
Right.
That responsibility really comes down to how can we grow that connection, because as you were saying, you teach kids, I teach kids, my kids are smaller than yours, and my goal at the end of the day is still the same as your goal. My content's a little bit different, right? Like I was having a conversation today with a coworker, and she was saying like I'm struggling with, what, how I feel about the world. This is her saying how she personally feels and the responsibility with kids. And I said, in my personal opinion, like, it is fine to have your own opinions. The kids can't know your own opinions.
Yeah.
Simply put, if your
Yeah.
opinion represents being a good human being and can kind of represent that, there can be underlying things that you can boost up your value, your passion, your interest, as long as it matches them developing as a human, them developing as an independent thinker. I think that's the hard part too, where we teach may happens to be a different view on life than where she grew up. And so, as an educator, it's super challenging to not necessarily push an agenda. I think that can be
Right.
dangerous, especially in your role, to kind
Yeah.
of, hey, this is how I feel. And I couldn't imagine teaching a debate class and sitting back and not finding favoritism. So can you kind of talk about like that unlocking and all of those type things, but also almost keeping yourself as uh, I would say almost as little influence as possible, probably in that classroom
Yeah.
environment.
I was just the term as you were talking, I kept wanting to fill in your blank and say like a neutral presence,
Yeah.
right? To be sort of like so two things. Like I first, we were living in Austin, my husband and I. We met in graduate school, and then we both taught at Texas State for a while. Then we're both writers. He was working for a nonprofit for writers. Austin is an incredibly liberal city, and part of and it's wonderful, right? That sounds like that's an awful thing, like, oh, Austin's so liberal. No, like it's this wonderful place. We were both very politically active. We're anyway, so that is to say, we were having that experience there. And at a certain point, we're also raising two boys. And at a certain point, I think we both were sort of questioning like that space and that like that term like echo chamber that kept coming out, and I was like, so here we are in this like really wonderful like liberal sort of oasis. So, they call it like this liberal oasis in Texas. And it's great, and we both we became very socially active. We felt like we were raising our sons to be like socially conscious, politically active. And it was like, but like it is we're in this echo chamber, so we're doing all this work and we're surrounding ourselves with these people who are doing that work. That's wonderful, that feels really good. But what's our bigger impact, and like even as parents, right? Like raising two white men in the world, like what do we want this to look like? And so moving into this like rural space, um where this is not a liberal oasis, right? And it's not, it's a very different place. I think has been incredibly instructive and like helpful, and kind of like the way that I wanted to grow as like a human being, a teacher and a person, a parent, was to kind of be in a space where where I might feel uncomfortable, like, or I might be like in a space where not everybody is constantly affirming my own beliefs, right? And so how that's played out in the classroom is really interesting because I teach all grades, and my seniors, I always teach the novel There by Tommy Orange to my seniors. And he is a native author, young guy. It's about urban Indians set in Oakland, California. It's just a cool ass book. It's such a good book, and my students really love it. And I teach, like I said, my school is on Pueblo land. Like, I teach many Native students, and then my other students, most of them have some kind of Hispanic heritage. Um, and it was interesting this time teaching it. I had one student who was incredibly vocal about like just resistant about reading about natives, though she was so into the book. And I think like, so I do a lot of supplemental stuff. So we had, I was doing these series of like nonfiction text woven into what we were reading. So we learned about the Urban Indian Relocation Program. We learned about the Native American protests at Alcatraz. We learned about, we started studying addiction rates among Native people. And it was on that day that she just like slumped down in her desk and was like rolling her eyes and she's like, oh. And I was like, what is going on here? Like what's the deal? And she was like, I don't know, this just all pisses me off. Like if they wanted help, they could get help. Um, it's just it's on them. It's on them. It's on them. And I like pulled up and we were reading like nonfiction, right? And I pulled up this map that showed that in this whole state of New Mexico, I think there are maybe one or two treatment centers specifically for Native Americans, right? So I was like, and we're a poor rural state. Like there's just not great access to the resources that would somebody could seek out the way that she was wanting them to. And so I pointed to the map, because I'm always like, so I'm thinking like, how did I try to stay a neutral presence? I was like, well, what do we do with these statistics about addiction within this community? What do we do about like all these factors that lead to addiction that are really prevalent in this community? What do we do with this map? And she was just so resistant, so resistant. And finally, I just stopped and I was like, look, you can't pull yourself up from your bootstraps. Like there are no straps. That's literally impossible. Like you're really having a hard time and I'm not sure why. Like wrapping your head around the fact that there is something more than just some kind of like personal like something inside you that's going to make you want to get help and get out of your situation. I was like there are all kinds of obstacles. And I just was thinking and looking at her, I'm like you face those obstacles too. Like you are, this could be you, right? Um, and it was the first time. I mean, everybody was on the edge of their seat because it was the first time they had really seen me kind of like lay down like what is my truth. But I felt in that space, like I felt confident in doing it because I was like, this is not, and I kept saying to her, like, and to the class, this is not my opinion, right? We are studying, we're reading this fictional tale about these people, but like then these are real numbers that exist. These are this is data, this is research, this is science, this is not an opinion. And so I think, within any classroom space that I've been in, my goal has never been to to I mean, people like to use that word indoctrinate, right? But like I don't want like that certainly isn't what I'm trying to do. I don't want to indoctrinate anyone and I have no interest in them like swaying them to like my point of view. It's like I want you as you're figuring out your point of view to like be actively figuring it out and have good information and have space to like think about this stuff, not just take the default position of your family, the community, the news bite that you heard, like no. That's all information that you should be taking in, but like do something with it. Like that doesn't you don't need to have my truth, which is always evolving, but like don't just take somebody else's. Like you need to figure this out on your own. Um and so I think especially, in the past, I mean, how many years, like 5 years, 6 years, like the way that, we've become so divisive. Um, it is, I think teachers are walking a challenging and fine line in the classroom,
Well, I think what's
with
tough about it
regards to that.
is, like you said, we don't want to necessarily share our opinion, but we want to offer the space where they can explore multiple sides. They can explore the research. You can challenge them in the way that they're thinking. You can be challenge them even if in the back of your mind you're thinking, I completely agree with you, but I'm still going to challenge you. But that tough space for teachers right now is things are so divisive. So you might have students that are extremely passionate about the topic, or their parents might be extremely passionate about the topic, and therefore the students are going to act extremely passionate. So it is a tough space to do so. It's still, I think, a necessary space to do so, but it takes that confidence, like you were saying, in being able to do that. But if more people do that, hopefully we're teaching a generation of what uh, good debate looks like, where it doesn't have to be divisive. You can disagree on something that you know may be blown out of proportion, but at the same time might be super simple. I wanted to
Right. And it might,
go ahead.
go ahead. No, I was just going to say, like, I might not, like, my intention is not to change your mind or bring you to a specific position. My intent, and I think especially with young people, um, even teenagers, like, I mean, I'm an English teacher. It is a cheesy metaphor, but it's like you're planting seeds and you may never see what comes of that, right? Like, so I may not see the evolution of their thinking in the time that they're with me in the classroom, but that doesn't mean that something that I introduce to them, some concept, some different opinion, some different viewpoint, some different approach, is not going to like snap with them 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, right? And sometimes, when you have a rough day and you're wondering, like, what am I even doing here? That can be really hard because you have to face that truth that you absolutely are making like an incredible impact, and you may never see that to fruition. You may never get that feedback. But that's okay. I mean, I feel like I get a lot of feedback from students, that's really positive, but you're not going to get it all the time. And so you just have to trust yourself that, like, I'm just planting seeds. I'm just putting this information out there. I'm just asking you to think about it. Um, and it becomes a part of, what we use the word schema, right? It becomes a part, then it's just a part of like your filter for taking in information, right? So it's not your parents, like, that's a part of your schema, and like Fox News or MSNBC or whatever. Like, but I'm just going to keep adding to that, so that when you approach that idea out in the world 5 years from now, you don't have such a limited view of what that situation is, right? Like, I've offered you something different. And that's one of the reasons why I love teaching fiction, and I'm very intentional with what I teach as a class novel. Because I feel like that's the intent, is to, like, pick texts that are going to really ask those kinds of questions, right? Or get them to ask those kinds of questions about who they are in the world, how they see the world, yeah, and how they take in information.
I think, we've had some guests on here that talk about navigating that, and I think you brought up this concept of how do you manage, how do you build, how do you open their eyes, how do you connect with them, and really what it comes down to is you do it through questioning, you do it through the opportunity for them to do that exploration. Um, and then there's a fair dose of remembering that you're the adult and that they are the child. And I think that's an important realization that, how frustrated you might get about a behavior issue, an exterior factor, or how they continue to not perform well in your class. There is this general responsibility to remember at the end of the day that you are the adult and you are paid to guide them. And if we're sitting here waiting for the time that we get enough validation, that we're doing the right thing, then we're going to be waiting a whole long time, and we're going to be missing opportunities. If that's what we're kind of sitting here saying, what, I'm waiting for that time that I get the thank you note, to show me the sign. You mentioned having a key song you would listen to your first year driving to and away from school to kind of get your mindset right, or whatever the case might be, right? Like that, there's a portion behind that of you do what you have to feel like you're doing the best thing for kids. At the end of the day, they are the kids, you are the adult, and you have to kind of figure out that kind of threshold. I know, Ken, in that situation, like, you have this balance between having taught younger kids and higher academic now by working in a high school, that management is different. I don't have any experience with that threshold. What can you kind of speak to in that realm of, um, balancing your own values, your own thoughts, and high school kids can have legitimate adult conversations. Sometimes they use vocabulary thinking that it's correct and it's nowhere close, trying to look like they're deeper in understanding than they really are. But what is that balance like for you currently, Ken?
Yeah, I would say the biggest difference that I've seen, because I would try to have these conversations with my fifth graders, is you talked about schema, Stephanie. The fifth grader schema, 99% of it is coming from their parents. The conversations they're hearing at the dinner table, or the comments that they're making while the TV's on, those types of things. When you get into secondary, middle school, especially high school, the kids are going to have that, and then they're probably watching the news, or now with social media, they're scrolling social media, they're seeing clickbait. They're seeing headlines. They're probably not reading much. There are kids that are, but I would say as you move into in the elementary space, I think your job is to find two opposite sided articles that you can kind of read and talk about, how the same topic has two very different standpoints, and you kind of expose them to that idea of there's different opinions, and maybe you don't even get into the debate of the topic, but you kind of expose them to that. Whereas in secondary, you're trying to say, okay, that is your opinion. Now let's look at these resources and look at the information, and does this change your opinion, or what do you at least understand the other side? So I think it's taking the effort to in the secondary to expose them to more of what's out there, because they probably have a strong opinion based on one side of what they're seeing things. Not to totally shift gears, but I want to try something. I want to try something different with you, Stephanie. So, you talked about in the beginning. You talked about seeing kids that were not engaged in their English class and didn't seem to be having fun. So, I would tell this to my students because I wanted to try to motivate them to be better readers. As a middle school student and as a high school student, I didn't read the books I was supposed to. So I was in honors classes because I was able to perform well in those classes, but I was always a very slow reader. I comprehend well, but my reading is very slow. And it got slower over the years because I stopped reading. I became frustrated with the text that we were supposed to be reading. I found the books incredibly boring. I couldn't power through them. I couldn't read as fast as my honors classmates. And I was honestly able to navigate English and reading with A's and B's for years, not reading, using Spark Notes, using different resources. I think it's developed a whole other skill set of that I have. So what I want to say is, let's pretend you're my senior year teacher, and I come to you on the first day of school and I tell you all that. What are you going to say to me that's going to make me think or hope or even consider that this year might be different, and I might actually start enjoy reading again, and I might actually read the books that you're going to tell me I have to?
Okay. So, I this year I started the school year with an independent novel project. So I recognizing that, I mean, we were here in northern New Mexico, we were remote. Most of my students were remote for the entire year. So students were invited back for the last quarter. Some came, most did not. So I was, teaching, you know, doing the hybrid model. I was live streaming, and teaching students who were at home with like 3 or 4 in the classroom. So anyway, I came into this year when we were going to be back in the classroom, knowing that my students, had spent a year without a lot of engagement, especially with any kind of like worthwhile reading. And so I said, you know what, we're going to start the year off and everybody's going to pick a book. And so what I did was I created like a reading interest survey and asked students. Only a couple of the questions were actually about reading. I was asking them about TV shows that they were watching, favorite movies, music that they liked, hobbies that they had. I asked a little bit about their reading history, but that wasn't really the point. And then I worked with the librarian at my school and just my own, experience with books. And I just worked on matching kids with books. Um, and tried really, really hard with, I had, at the time, I think I had maybe 70, let's say 60 students who I was trying to do that with. It was really challenging. Again, we're in, it's a small school, it's a small library, but it's actually full of very relevant young adult fiction, titles. And I said, you're gonna pick your book and you're gonna get space in here to read. And then in the end, students had the opportunity to choose several different very creative options for presenting to myself and the class the book that they read. um, there was so much about this project that was incredibly just affirming and worthwhile. I remember one student who literally, like, I saw her walking in the hallways reading, like walking and reading, right? One of my students who is, one of our star basketball players, just I have like some flexible seating options in my classroom, including these like just kind of little mats. And this was a student who I had heard like, oh yeah, he'll just like flop around on the floor, and he's a senior. And there he was, like, took the mat, and he's this big kid, and he's just laying there, like, reading All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley, which is like this incredible book that I knew he would love. The reality is, and I was real straight with my kids about it, in the end, I was like, I know that not all of my students read their books. I know that they didn't. And in part, like, when I adjust that assignment in the future, there are some things that I would do to kind of help them to keep pace and figure out, like, get to the end. But a lot of my students did. A lot of my students read the entire book that they chose and created these really engaging, wonderful projects. Um, and I think, it's choice and voice. It's like, I really believe that our brains are wired for story, and that our students, even my students who might be reading below grade level, it's not illiteracy, they're illiterate. They haven't been introduced to the kind of books that are going to keep them like walking down the hallway and reading at the same time. So I guess that's what I would say to you as a senior is like, let's find your book. I believe that, like, there are things like gateway books. I'm like, you read this one book and you get all, I mean, you're thinking all these things and you get a feeling, like you get attached, or you feel, I had one student who said to me, as read, and this is a student who did not finish his whole book. I found this out, but early on in the days of him reading, he was like, the craziest thing just happened to me. Like, I just laughed out loud while I was reading. He's like, that's never happened to me before. And so just introducing reading as not as a chore, but as this gift, like as this like incredible like thing that you can give yourself, like that you could just sit down and like get into this book and it's yours and it's like you're into it. And you can black out the world. And I mean, our kids are doing that. They're blocking out the world in lots of ways. Not often by picking up books, but I get frustrated with this narrative that's like, the kids these days narrative always bugs me. But like, even when it comes to reading, I'm like, it's not it we have to find them their book. We have to get the, that's a part, and that's a part of, like, a huge part of what I feel like my job is like connecting kids to their books.
I think one of the things that I love hearing from your end is it seems like you feel like it's your responsibility to connect with students, and this may be a misnomer or a misinterpretation, but as an elementary school teacher, I feel like that is frequently my experience. I am transitioning kids from uh, learning how to read or learning how to learn, right, and transitioning into instructing true content. Not to say that below fourth grade there's not content being developed, but it really is essentially that gateway into true building block learning. And I think what I'm hearing from you, Stephanie, is something I just always assumed is not that every high school class is a lecture by any means. Obviously, you have labs and you have interactive activities, but a lot of times people, and I wonder if this was something you experienced at the higher ed level as well, where it's, you know what, I am employed in this role to be the authority. And to be the authority means I'm selecting great pieces. And I'm selecting great pieces, which means you need to figure out a way to get through it because of the lineage that someone identified this as a high quality piece. And I think I'm a highly educated person chosen for this role. So what I say is really important where, you know, and I don't know if that type of independent book project is something you've done for years, or it was really you recognizing currently in the state of education in your school climate, what was necessary was an opportunity to connect learners as almost this warm back up into learning.
Yes.
And what
Yeah.
we found out of it, which we often find when we put items into the hands of kids, instead of us being the control freaks that we like to be. I'm not claiming that you are, but
Yeah, no.
we like to right the ship. Um,
Right.
that things turn out well beyond what we ever create when it's just us.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were just some like really beautiful moments that happened, that I don't think, that would have been different if students had not had that sort of opportunity to direct their own learning, right? Like, just, the students who were engaged and who um, stayed with their books to the end. Um, it was such a valuable experience, and I ended by having like students had to present. They had so many choices for like different kinds of projects that they did, and so we sort of did like a round table where students sat with their projects, and then others walked around and asked about the projects, and then I had them at the end of each class. I said, now they were taking notes while they were looking at others projects, and I said, now so your last reflection is to tell me which book are you most likely to read and why, based on like this experience that you've had. And so, again, I'm not going to say like that all the conversations were like, everybody's trudging to the library to go like, pick up, running to the library to pick up the books they heard about. But there were like really enthusiastic conversations that were happening where it's like, you know, kids, I could watch them as they're talking about their books, like getting really excited about, the chance to talk about what they'd read and how much they'd enjoyed them. So um, that kind of, after a year of being online, I just felt like, yeah, that I wanted to use that as an opportunity to say, like, we're going to, this is a space for you, and where I want you to feel like you have some autonomy um, in certainly in what you read, and then how you choose to present like what you've learned. um that's really important to me, and it's also really I mean, it's so challenging, and like incredibly so, right? It's such hard work to try to really individualize the work for the student, right? um but it's the results are pretty astounding.
Yeah, and
um
it gets easier. You know, the more you do it, the more you're comfortable with it. The systems are in place, the checkpoints, the way you navigate it. And like you said, even if one student, I'm sure it was more, but even if one student starts reading more because of that experience, that's a win. that's a win by all means. And you mentioned like choice and autonomy. When you can offer that to students, I know I'm pretty sure I've shared this before, but very simple concept. I have to When I taught fifth grade and I started teaching science, we were supposed to teach about Earth biomes, and they were supposed to learn about adaptations, behavioral, biological, all those different types. And the resources I got were PowerPoint presentations on specific animals and plants and what their adaptations were. And I looked at this and said, I don't care what animal they research. I just want them to know, I want them to be able to differentiate between the types of adaptations, find specific features. And so I said, I taught them the adaptations. I said, okay, here's our first biome, find some animals and plants. And it turned into a project where they started making video documentaries like they were there. We watched Steve Irwin for some inspiration, and I gave them choice on the order of the biomes they went through. And it was just specific criteria they had to find information on, because I really don't care what animal they research as long as they understand the concept. It's that idea of just anytime you can give them a little bit of choice or as much choice as possible, they're going to step up more because they're more interested. And that has nothing to do with students. That's people. We like choice. We like to be able to make our own decisions. So I want to move into our exit ticket, which is the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. So question number 1: what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
Hmm. The best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better is to see them. I mean, just really, I just like, and again, I don't think this is a student thing. Like you said, Ken, I think this is a human thing. We want to be seen, um, for who we are, whether we're the best version of ourselves that day or not. And I just, one of the things I used to say to my student teachers was like, the most important thing for you to do from day, you have to memorize, you have to know who your students are within the first couple of days. You have to be able to call them by name. And then you take it a step further, and like I do, student interest surveys, and so find out a little bit about the students so that I can check in with, look over those surveys and one day be like, oh yeah, like I see, like, you're a Cowboys fan, I'm an Eagles fan, I mean, just like to start building those relationships and to make that connection and to be like, I see you as a person in this room. I think that's the most important thing that you can do to help a student, with their school experience.
I love that answer, and I love that you started it by repeating the question as a sentence. Such an English teacher move, but it's perfect.
It really was, and I was aware of it as I was doing it. My students are really great at that. The middle school teacher, who they have before me, she does such a wonderful job with teaching them that basic like reframing of a question, into your answer. Yeah, so I felt like I wanted to throw that out there.
So the next question really comes down to a piece of advice, that best piece of advice you might have received. You think about frequently. It could have come from a colleague, supervisor, or even a student.
Yeah. Um, my mentor when I was in Houston, Matt Olson. I was really struggling to think of his name. It's been a long time, and I haven't. We've lost touch. But very early on, he said to me, "Teaching is a marathon, not a sprint." And he had a long career. I think, I mean, stayed in education for all the years till he retired. And I guess I've been thinking about that a lot, returning to the high school classroom, because I think particular for a couple reasons. I think like you had mentioned, Ken, like I'd been out of the high school classroom for so long and wanted so badly to return. And I think too, coming out of the pandemic, just feeling like I wanted to do it all at once. Like I not even that I wanted to, I have to do it all at once. Um, and I'm starting now to like just kind of remind myself of that advice, right? Like it's, if this is for the long term, like you need to just slow it down a little bit, um, give yourself grace, give your students a lot of grace, um, and you know, look at the bigger picture. Don't feel like you have this finish line that you're racing towards. Like it's, you know, it's not a sprint.
That kind of leads into our next question, but I'll challenge you to kind of either reframe it or kind of pull a different answer. And really, it talks about how in a school year there are ups and downs. It kind of goes in waves. There's days that you know what you can't believe you got paid to do this incredible thing in school, and then there's days that you struggle to make it through, whether it's conferences, report cards, those type of things, even just a parent email that throws you off, right? So what is something that you think of that allows you to kind of rise up and power up to meet that moment of struggle?
So earlier we were talking about like seeing ourselves, like recognizing that we're the adult in the room, but and also like I just I'm there for the kids, right? Like I'm there, like just remembering my dear friend who I work with, who's a girls basketball coach and history teacher, like always says, just go back to your why, you know? And so particularly I think in the challenging, you know, 2 years that we've had, and that was challenging. It was challenging for educators everywhere, and for me to move into this new space, to, like you said, leave academia, come back into the public high school, have uprooted my family. Like everything happens all at once as the pandemic hit. Um, and so challenges all the time, and just coming back to like, why am I here? Like I'm here. I'm going to show up for my students every day. I'm going to show up and be working towards that best version of myself every day that I'm in the classroom. Um, and that's it. I mean, there's so many students. I've been, again, in this position at the school for a really brief time. Um, and on those hard days, I immediately like put a student's face in my mind, and I think about that kid, and I'm like, okay, like that was hard. This was a hard day. This was hard. You're going to come back tomorrow, you know, and you're showing up for that kid, or you're showing up for that kid, you're showing up for all the kid, but just to sort of remind myself and ground myself of like, why am I doing this anyway? And it's why I've been in education for 25 years. I mean, it's just the most important, I just feel like it's the most important work that there is. And so even on the hard days and trying to talk yourself, up, it's like what you're doing matters. Um, just keep showing up.
I don't know if it's right now the time of year, but the idea of just like I when you said that, I closed my eyes and I was just kind of cycling through the kids that I interact with, and you just like, it is really hard to finish that activity and remember what you're upset about. It's a huge like calming device, and you're like, even that mindset of like, you know what, I want to learn something new about that kid tomorrow. It is a very simple goal setting. um, so I think that's a
Well,
great
and
answer.
it's my husband, we work in the same district, we work in the same schools, different capacities. And we really try to balance our conversations about the work with like what was hard about the day, but then we'll say like, okay, like, well, tell me, let's get into the good stuff, and it's without fail, we always, no matter how hard the day was and what we had to sort of like navigate, we end up with like these really sweet stories about kids, and because our district is so small, we know all the kids, so even most of his work so far has been with the elementary kids. But when I mention, a middle or high school kid that I had, and he knows that kid too, and it's so, yeah, and it's just like, it's just really rich um to remember those moments, and to like, to laugh or feel good about what happened, or just like, to reflect on a connection that you had. I mean, because it is hard, and for teachers everywhere right now, this is no joke. Like we are, man, like we are in a marathon, It's never going to end. And we're all running at a sprint, like in that marathon. It's just, this is such a wild time. And it's so easy to fall into some kind of like questioning and despair. And I think when you find yourself falling into those places, if you can bring it back to like, what are you doing this for? And it's just, it, it helps. It helps to, keep you going into that next day. Sometimes the next class period or whatever, but um, yeah, just reminding yourself of your why.
You can't do it enough. So important, especially in the industry we're in, which is the we're in the people business. So the last question before Matt's more of his is more of a request. So it's so easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What separates teachers who constantly seek change, innovation, and pursuing new teaching strategies in their classroom?
I mean, I think honestly, a lot of it is like access and experience. I mean, I feel really fortunate to have, and I mean, I joke with my kids all the time, and tell them like, I'm a nerd and that's awesome. Like, let's all be nerds. Like, I'm always like wondering, how could I do this better? Or like, how would this book like slap with my kids? Or like, and so, but I also am aware that like I've had a lot of access and I've had a lot of resources. I mean, um, I getting into Teach for America, like that, sort of that broadened all of my experiences. And then going to graduate school, which is not something that everyone has the opportunity to do. And I got to go, and I also that started my college career, and I felt like I really got to like refine my teaching while I was there, and had all kinds of professional development opportunities. And then working in the university, of course, right? So I do think like there is, I think, this intrinsic, you know, just student in you that wants to be, a lifelong learner. Like, you want to model that for your students. But I also don't want to say that and not acknowledge that like there's access and resource, right? That I felt um I was always in, I've just always been in positions to like keep, you know, observing, learning, getting better. And I don't think we all have it's not an equitable system. I don't think that like teachers around the country, all over are having those same kinds of like experiences, right? Um, yeah. So I think that's, there is, I mean, but I feel like if you go into teaching, it seems like one common thread of people who go into teaching is that like there's something about school and learning that they like, right? And so then I think that it's as incumbent as it might be on us as educators to be innovative, flexible, and everything. Like it also really helps if you're that professional development that you have access to that kind of work, and that kind of work is being valued, right? During a time when like, you know, when I was teaching in Houston and how important like standardized test scores were, like that's not really valuing innovation, creativity, or, I don't know, that's valuing a score at the end of the day, right? So I think where you teach can really influence how you grow as a teacher. And yeah.
Stephanie, I know I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, and I feel like your perspective is very enlightening, but also just um, in line with just what feels like the right thing for kids, the right teaching principles. So, whether passively or actively, to continue this conversation, what would be the best way to follow along with what life is like in your classroom or what's going on? Are you active on social media or have a website or anything we could continue the conversation with?
I mean, I don't like, I'm not very like, I mean, I have like, I feel like an old lady, right? Because Facebook is for like the old ones among us. And there have been times where I've, wondered about, you know, making, creating some kind of like blog as a way to like track the work that I do, but not, I mean, there isn't. It's just
That's
kind of
okay.
like,
Totally.
here I am.
They just have to come
Not
to New Mexico to
Yeah,
find you. If they come to the town, if they go to the town, they clearly
that's
won't have
right. I
to
mean, come
spend too
check it
much time
out.
finding you.
Oh, they wouldn't. I mean, you could just, yeah, I mean, they'll tell you where I live. So one of I've like so many students who live like, I mean, on the road that I live on, and, one who just like, beep beep every time he drives by, and used to bring us
That's
eggs.
awesome.
One time he brought a kitten. I mean, like this is the small
That's wonderful.
the rural life that we're living that Austin wasn't quite offering.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's great. So to echo what Matt said, I agree, Stephanie. This has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you. Any topics that we talked about or information, all can be found on our website at powereduup.com/show59. So if this is the first time listening to this because you know Stephanie or you just found us, please make sure you subscribe to our podcast on whichever app you're using, or if you're watching us on YouTube, hit the subscribe button there as well. If you have the time, leaving us a rating and review will help us grow and find new educators, because we want to continue to empower others by hearing the stories, the ideas, and the crafts that these amazing guests are using that we get to talk to almost every week. So I think that's just about it for tonight. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. And Mr. Rogers, why don't you close down shop for us?
All right. As we power down this episode, Stephanie, you left us feeling powered up. Um, Everyone, thank you for the time. Stay well, stay healthy. I know it's a fun time of year, and it's only going to get even more enjoyable in the next few weeks. So do what it takes to take care of yourself, and we'll talk to you guys next time.